record, and welcome everyone. I am here with Matthew Pearl, founder. You're founder, right? Co-founder?
Co-founder.
Of Truly Adventurous. As always, guests, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation with Matthew. So let's jump in. Tell us when you co-founded the magazine and why. What prompted you to want to create the magazine?
Yeah, thank you for having me and for letting me talk about Truly Adventurous. So it was some years ago now, I'd have to count, that I had coffee. Actually, I was living at the time in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So anyone who knows that area, you're one of them who would know. I met a writer named Greg Nichols for coffee at Simon's Cafe in Cambridge. And it was actually the writer and historian and professor Megan Marshall, who teaches at Emerson, who had kind of connected us, because we were both working on the same kind of long-form narrative nonfiction. Now, I also come out of a fiction writing background, but I had gotten more and more into writing long-form narrative nonfiction. Oh my gosh, these words are so sometimes unhelpful. But and also terms of art, and sometimes mean different things, right, in different formats. So the example I always think of is long form, which means something completely different in fiction than it does in nonfiction, right? But in nonfiction, it actually doesn't really have much of a definition, but more or less, it means something much longer than your typical newspaper or magazine article, which normally, if we just pick an article at random in a traditional publication, it would probably be a couple hundred to 1,000, maybe pushing to 1,500 words, right? And then we look at books and we're jumping to much, much longer, right? So probably your shortest, let's think just nonfiction in this case, nonfiction book would be 70,000 words, right? So we're looking at more sort of that 5,000, 6,000 word piece. It could be longer, it could be a bit shorter. But I really fell in love with that format for when I started writing nonfiction. I tried my hand at a couple other nonfiction formats that I really didn't gel with, like op-eds. I wrote a couple op-eds, at least one of which I was very proud of because I felt like it made a difference in something, but it was miserable working on it for me. I'm also not good at having opinions, which is probably a bad match for writing an op-ed. So I fell in love with this format, but I also ran into a brick wall, and my soon-to-be very close friend Greg, who I was meeting for the first time in that coffee shop, had run into the same brick wall, which was that traditional publications are actually not set up for narrative. They're not set up for storytelling. You'll see them come out the other side. You'll find a great narrative piece in Esquire, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, Vanity Fair, but behind the curtain, that's happening despite the process, the editorial process that's set up, not because of it. And the reality is that for lots of good reasons, traditional publications are largely set up to be tied into the news cycle, right? Which, look, we need that, right? Or to a very specific topic that can sell advertisements, right? So Sports Illustrated or Popular Mechanics are two examples I think of that can do awesome narrative, but it has to fit into their very, very specific silo that fits how their business model works, which is to fill the screen or the page with ads, right? That kind of fit the topic. Most narrative, or you can try. I did this several times where I would try to sort of shape a pitch using lots of acrobatics and gymnastics to fit what one of those magazines might publish, right? But it's a long shot. And what we saw, for Greg and I both kind of bonded over, was that frustration that we saw in our own desks and computer files, and in every writer we encountered who wrote in this space or wanted to write in this space, was just an endless number of stories that were not getting told, that were either getting written and not published. They were getting written and kind of assigned at a publication, but never actually ending up being published. because this is the type of story that could just get bumped and bumped and bumped and bumped, since it's not tied to a specific moment in the news, right?
Mhm.
Or never getting written at all because there was no editorial or financial support for it. So we put our heads together and said, why are we doing this? Why are we fighting the system to try to write what we want to write? Can we potentially create our own brand, our own platform that allows our own stories and other writers' stories to have a home without having to go through this gauntlet. And that's where Truly Adventurous was born. It's a digital magazine that every 3 to 4 weeks publishes a new feature, a new long form narrative nonfiction piece. And in the beginning, there were a fair number of stories by Greg or by me. At this point, very rarely, we have freelance writers who have written for us and are writing for us all over the world. And that's been just such a great experience, and I'm fortunate to be one of a small team of editors that oversees that process.
Sure. That's great. Really, really interesting. I have so many questions, but I want to back up for 1 second and ask a very basic question, which is that I know you have an asterisk in the title of this, so it's Truly Asterisk Adventurous. So can you explain that meaning?
We'd have to ask Greg, who named it, like sort of as we were talking about it. As we were talking about this frustration, he started thinking actually of a newsletter. That was the first thing he was thinking of that would curate long form content and then occasionally do an original. And I gave him some feedback on that. And then one evening I said to my wife, I wonder if I could get involved in that with Greg. And it's very unlike me to sort of raise my hand, literally, from the time I was young. In fact, I've run into teachers over the years who had me when I was, my kid's age, when I was in second grade or fourth. And yeah, they remember I just wouldn't speak. I just wouldn't. So it's always been hard for me. But I did raise my hand, so to speak, to Greg and say, hey, is this something you might be open to me getting involved in? And that's where it evolved. He had already chosen the title. Truly Adventurous, which I love, and the asterisk is just to make it pop, just to make it stand out.
Okay. It's so interesting to hear you talk about the magazines not publishing long form, because when I think of those magazines, Esquire and Playboy and like these, I also think of new journalism, right? Like, is that form totally dead now, would you say? Like the, Norman Mailer, Hunter S. Thompson, Tom Wolfe, like they were doing really important stuff. So what happened there?
Totally. It's not that it's dead. There's a couple things. One is that there's a very small camp of writers who deservedly can write this type of thing. David Gran, the lovely Susan Orlean, can write those types of pieces whenever they want, right? And we should all be thankful for that because they're brilliant writers. That said, it's a very closed ecosystem. So there's a couple of problems. One is that the pieces that do get, so it's an exhausting amount of editorial resources to support long form narrative nonfiction, and it doesn't really fit the business model of those magazines. So it's very hard for a writer who hasn't done it before, or even a writer who's done it before but is not at that level, which statistically speaking, nobody is, right? In terms of whatever you want to call it, prestige, leverage, access, right? It's just almost impossible to find homes for that. So we would argue that almost everything we published could not have been or would not have been published elsewhere. There's a couple exceptions, and in fact, we've done co-publications with some other publications, and in those cases, part of what we're doing is we're serving the role of saying to, for instance, Boston Globe Magazine, where we've done 2 co-publications, hey, this kind of piece is so resource intensive, but we as your partner can handle that part of it, and you can handle helping us platform it and give it more readership. But even in those cases, there's a lot of pushback to anything too long, right? In traditional publications, and long form, by its nature, at least the way we see it, is a beginning and a middle and an end, and that takes room to breathe. It takes room to grow as a piece and to evolve. So yeah, it's not that it's not that it's not possible elsewhere, but it's a struggle. It's a fight. And look, it's never easy. It's never easy to write. It's never easy to find a home for what we write. But if you're also fighting a system that's not particularly looking for what you're writing, it's sort of all the more frustrating. And one of the nice things has been that the types of writers that we are able to bring into our stable come from everywhere. They come from, some of them are traditional journalists, some of them are memoirists, and we're trying to increase our footprint with our first person stories. Some of them come from fiction, from creative nonfiction, from poetry. I mean, they could really come from anywhere, because at least we're big believers in that writers, I think sometimes we put writers too firmly into categories, and especially me, I'm someone who comes from fiction and added nonfiction. I definitely push back against that tendency.
So interesting. So you have a background as a novelist. I think you've published 3 novels now. Is that correct? Yes.
No, I think I've published 6, 7.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I forgot about those. Okay, so you published 6 novels.
I forget about.
So what is so interesting, like what are the tools of fiction that you how did you make that shift to nonfiction in your interests? And then as an editor of nonfiction, what are the kind of tools from fiction that you bring to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know that I have a precise answer. I mean, for me, it would be different for everyone. And we've definitely had fiction writers write pieces for us who come out of very different types of fiction than I happen to have written or to write. For me, because I wrote historical fiction largely when I've written fiction, part of it was the research. So there's historical fiction writers who really are writing in spite of the research. They can't stay on the research. They can't wait to be done with whatever the minimum amount is. I happen to have loved that part of it, and I would get frustrated when I would publish historical fiction that had material that I was really excited that I had found, in some cases that had never been found before or never been put in any kind of format before, and it would simply get lost in fiction because, rightfully so, fiction readers are not actually reading your novel in order to discover something that that wasn't known about 1850 Baltimore or whatever it is, right? So that was actually part of what led me to start writing nonfiction, is that you could showcase those stories that you find that either don't fit in fiction or get sort of blurred in with fiction. So that again was very specific to me because I was doing a lot of historical research, and so my first narrative nonfiction writing was all historical. It was actually in the period that I was also writing fiction about. In fact, my very first one, which was for the Atavist magazine, which is sort of a similar comp to Truly Adventurous in some ways, was actually one that I had put together as a proposal, or sorry, before I wrote it as nonfiction, I put together a proposal on that story for fiction. I put together an 80-page proposal, and it just didn't fly with my team. I can't remember exactly. I think my agent really clicked with it, but my editor at the time did not, with the publisher that I was working with then. So I put it in a drawer for years, but it always stuck with me, and that's what sort of got me thinking, hey, could I try my hand at this? So that's where I came. But I see in fiction writers frequently some of the storytelling techniques that we don't particularly encourage or formally train for many journalists in particular. No, this is not no offense to journalists. It's simply not part of the sort of curriculum that is usually presented to journalists or the focus. In fact, many journalists have tell us that they were sort of pushed against doing sort of telling their stories in any narrative way, because it just doesn't fit a lot of the formats, the often, I think, antiquated formats in which we present those stories. But that's a different conversation. So I think fiction writers will often bring that to the table.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about what you envision long form journalism to be, or what the long form narrative pieces that you're publishing? How are they different from journalistic articles? Like, it's obviously
Yeah.
it's not just the word count. There's something going on. There's some kind of inner development of the piece that is different than a journalistic article. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. It's we really for our pieces, we're really looking for it to be character driven, character in this case being real people. But still in the way that we're relating to the events on the page, we're wanting to sort of be immersed in the world of a character or characters, and really see how that progresses in some way that takes us on a journey. It's not static. And very often with magazine pieces, we're giving snippets, traditional magazine pieces, we're getting snippets of storytelling, but that are very quickly sort of abandoned, or at the very least alternated with, say, well, I'll give a specific example. One of the stories that I did for Truly Adventurous is called "The Exorcisms of Emma," and I was able to find in a seminary archive these records of these exorcisms that this priest performed on this young woman in the 1930s that had been kind of buried. So the story I was looking to structure was the entire story of the woman meeting the priest, the goal of the exorcisms, sort of following through with a beginning, middle, and end. As I say, it sounds very simple. It was interesting because around that same time, I happened to notice an article about exorcisms in the Atlantic Monthly, and it started with a story, and that was about present day exorcisms, but it started with the story of a young woman getting an exorcism, but immediately broke away into a bird's eye view of what are the statistics of how many exorcisms are performed every year, right? What are the official stances of the church? In other words, the narrative just abruptly ends. And very much opposite of what we are striving to do, which is to have a narrative that builds and builds and builds, and you have to keep reading. You can't stop yourself from continuing to read because you have to see where it goes, just like we try to do when we write, when you or I write fiction.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's making me think. I'm guessing it sounds like from what you're saying that the pieces that you present are maybe not taking quite a stance necessarily. They're presenting a story and they're letting the reader make for it what they will. Whereas like a piece like the Atlantic, like that you just described, it's like they're trying to convince the reader of something. They're putting forward an argument. Here's the premise, here's the examples, here's the data, and so on, which is very useful. But what you're doing is more like fiction in that you're just presenting the situation, telling this story, and letting it sort of sink into the reader in whatever way it will.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And that's a great example of it. We have a sort of subset of our stories that are we call truly horror, not in the sense that they're horrifying, but in the sense that they sort of fit with what we now know of as a genre, as horror, like this story about the exorcisms. And right, we're not trying to convince you that she was actually possessed. And we're not trying to convince you she wasn't, right? We're giving the experiences of the people and of the sort of events as they were lived, and also sort of structuring it and shaping it. Another thing with nonfiction is that a lot of people think nonfiction just kind of falls out of the sky, fully formed, right? And it's just as crafted as any form of writing, right? And this is what I try to talk to my kids about with writing, because they're at various ages of when school encourages them to start writing more, is that we know writing is easy. No writing just happens, right? And And I think that's particularly hard for people because nonfiction, we associate it with something else. We associate it with something that just exists
Mhm.
because it's true. It comes from real life, and that's not the case. There's hundreds, thousands of choices. Just like with fiction, it's obvious with fiction that you have to make choices every word in every sentence, but it's not as obvious to people with nonfiction. And yeah, it's, not, I mean, that's maybe a whole other conversation, but even the word nonfiction is, it's sort of an enigma. It's, in fact, if I understand correctly, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, it's not even a word that exists in most languages. It was sort of an invented word for categorizing books in a library at some point. But other countries, other languages have sort of biography, history. They don't have that catch-all term, which interestingly, all it means is not fiction.
Right. So this is also a fiction writer's experience, but I'm wondering, when you're working with your authors, do you ever have the experience that you start out thinking that the piece is about one thing, and then as you're working on it, you or the author or both collectively are like, oh my God, no, this is it's really about demonic possession, or it's not, it's really about a girl, growing up in Italy,
Right.
or whatever, that you sort of like find the real story in the process of editing and writing it.
Yeah, probably not as much as you could do with fiction, because you are constrained by the material that you have access to, and usually at the stage in which we are deciding to trigger a story with a writer, we all, the writer and on our team, have to have some sense of what that material is. Is it an archive from the 1930s? Is it three people that the writer is going to be able to access for interviews that lived through or were involved in some story? So because that material will certainly get added to, and some of it will fall, will sort of collapse and end up not being accessible. You have some sense of what those materials are. So it would be trickier. I'd have to look through all the examples to see if we've ever made a complete shift. But it would be tricky because that's happened to me with fiction, many times. So it's probably not quite as flexible in terms of what you think you're doing and what you end up doing. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens is a story just has to get canceled. For example, if a source who we think is going to speak to the writer or has agreed to speak to the writer, then decides, which happens, not uncommon in reporting, decides, oh, you know what, I don't want to talk about this story, or I don't want to share my experiences. And if that was your main access point or your only access point, the story itself might unfortunately just sort of disappear. But it's, that's one of the other things, is that we love to find actual, just incredible stories of people that writers know, that they've encountered, that they could, potentially turn into, or their own story. Again, we're trying to expand our footprint in that first person voice as well, that they can sort of expand into a full narrative.
And do you have a team of fact checkers? Is that something that you need to do in the process before publication?
We're not a big enough sort of footprint to have a devoted fact checker. Even freelance, those resources really go to copy editing and to design. So the editor, which for some of them I'm the editor, will sort of be doing that throughout. So sort of as we go, we'll be looking at the materials, we'll be looking at or listening to interview recordings of interviews, or looking at the transcripts, and we'll be sort of side by side in parallel with the writer, checking those things as we go. And knock on wood, that's worked well so far.
Sure. So take us, if you will, through the editorial process, and also, can you tell us about the different categories? Because you mentioned horror. I know there's action adventure, true crime. So tell us all the categories, and then what happens start to finish. A writer has an idea, they come to you, and it goes on.
Absolutely. We're always, I don't even know what the categories are now that we have on our digital magazine on our website, because we're always changing those. But what I always say is that we have no agenda. So that's a huge differentiator from most magazines that will publish or consider narrative nonfiction. We don't have advertisers. We don't have, readers don't pay for the content. So we're not trying to triangulate what will appeal to a certain way to monetize the stories, right? Which is what traditionally we would do in newspapers or magazine. What I always say is that I love to anticipate and thankfully hear two reactions in particular to our stories. One, how is this true? And two, how did I never hear about this before? So those are kind of what we look for, and kind of reflect what we think we've been able to do, which is to really excavate and uncover types of stories that get overlooked, and specific stories that will get overlooked, tend to get overlooked or passed over because they can't be, so to speak, justified to traditional publications. So about I'd say about 60% of our stories, I was just looking through this in anticipation of chatting with you. In 2022, we published 16 stories, and 7 of them were brought to us by writers. The others we developed in-house. And in 2021, it was 19 stories total, and 8 of them were brought to us by writers. So what does that mean? We have, part of what we do as a team internally is we're constantly searching for story kernels. That's just what we call it, right? Little hints of, and it could be something a neighbor mentions to us that happened, 5 years ago, in our neighborhood, or it could be something that we find. One of the stories that I assigned this past year, or that we published this past year, was the origin story of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar gets kidnapped when he's 25 years old by pirates. And as he's brought to this island where he's going to be imprisoned, he says, oh, just so you guys know, by the way, this is when Caesar was a nobody. He was just this kid, basically. So just so you guys know, I'm going to come back after I get ransomed, and I'm going to kill every single one of you. And they all laugh. It's exactly what ends up happening. But that's a story, just as an example, that I had my eye on. And I talked to several writers who were understandably sort of terrified of the idea of writing it before I found.
Sorry, can I interrupt you for a second? What do you mean
Yeah.
you had your eye on it? Like you read it, you read part of it in a magazine somewhere? How did you?
Yeah, I think it was like a footnote in something I was reading about Julius Caesar, that he was once taken by pirates, and then I read up more on it. And what happens with a lot of stories, particularly in history, is they get absorbed into academia. And academics, not unlike journalists, are very much almost explicitly not allowed to engage in storytelling, right? They're academics who sort of escape that and are able to publish kind of separately from their academic publications. But academic publications are not supposed to be readable by you or by me. They're very intentionally meant to sort of limit the audience, right? So that happens fairly frequently, where there'll just be like a little glimmer of something. And it could also happen in the news, right? It could also just be, it could be a news story that gets chopped up into so many pieces that there's just, you are reading little events that happen, but it never is told as a story. An example of that is a story we did called The Han Twins. And that was about a young woman, an Asian American woman in California, who decided to murder her identical twin sister. So this would be in the truly criminal category, we call it. And luckily she failed to murder her, but it's still this incredible story of, just thinking of it, like planning the murder of essentially yourself, your DNA replica, who literally looks like you. In fact, there's a scene where she escapes the police because she says she's her sister, who she just tried to murder. Anyway.
That's I have so many questions. I have so many questions.
So, but that would be an example of that. It wasn't an invisible story. In other words, when it happened, which now I have to refresh my memory, I think it was either the late 90s or the early 2000s, that attempted murder. It was covered in that region of California as things happened, right? So there would have been an article in your local newspaper when she was arrested. There would have been an article or two about the trial, right? But the actual story was never put together in, again, what we call long form. So it doesn't, we love to find stories that are literally invisible, that have never been touched before. We had one last year called The Champions that I found just by, I was really interested in, I grew up going to arcades, you know, in the 80s, and was just looking around at arcade stories and found this centipede competition, just a mention of this, these three women who ended up being sort of competing for the women's championship of
Mhm.
Centipede, which was designed by a woman. It was the only major arcade game designed by a woman. So yeah, I found one of the writers who we already had worked with, named Corey Mead. He went and he found the women. The competition was in 1981. So these were pretty shocked women.
Right.
The women were pretty shocked, I should say, when Corey called them or emailed them saying, "Hey, do you remember when you were?" And Corey also got to interview Donna, who designed Centipede, created Centipede, and then was shut out of the sequel to Centipede by men who were jealous of her
Yeah.
success because it was one of the most successful companies. So that's an example of a story that had just never been told at all,
Right.
that I found mentions of in blogs about sort of the history of arcade games.
So here's a question. It's sort of a craft question, but you mentioned, and I think this is so fascinating. The woman who wanted to murder her twin sister
Yeah,
is sort of a murder of herself.
right.
Now, in what process of the story imagining who brings that idea to it, right? Because like a journalist would just report on the story, but the idea that she would be murdering herself is like this whole philosophical, existential component. And is that something that comes from the writer, or is that something that you as editors, bring to the story and help the writer tease out? Or is it like, at what part in the process do you find that part of the story?
Yeah, great question, and I think that probably reflects your craft as a fiction writer, because
Mm,
that's how, when we approach fiction, we're probably, we're trying to integrate those kinds of big concepts and ideas,
right,
right,
right.
into the story that we're building. So in that case, we would be talking about that internally, like what
Mm,
excites us about this story. Most stories that we look into, including the stories that our small team bring to the table, we end up putting aside and saying there's just not enough that's special here. There's not enough that sort of rises to the surface and animates it. So we would sort of pick that out right away. We would say, hey, this is what excites, and we might argue the case for it to each other and say, hey, this is what's exciting me about this story. And it would be one of the first things we talk to a writer about. So in that case, we would look for a writer. We did look for a writer and found one who was already sort of in that community, writing about that community.
mm,
Again, one of the great things I love about Truly Adventurous is that the writers can come from anywhere. For the Caesar story, our writer on that, Rob, he teaches classics at a high school. So he translates ancient Latin, and he sort of had all the tools to do it, and he was excited about the story. So sometimes we're working with academics, sometimes we're working with folks who most often are writing for the kind of literary magazines that you cover so well and in depth. But yeah, in the case of the Han twins, we would sort of put that out as part of our vision for it. Whether it comes out in the story itself explicitly, I honestly would have to reread Han Twins if I don't know that it does.
mm,
I hope that a reader will get it from reading the story, but it might. And often what happens is other people you're interviewing for a story like that. So some of our stories, obviously, no one is alive anymore, like Caesar. Or we did another story about pirates called The Revenge of Anne and Mary, which are about two of the first female pirates,
mm,
who were also probably lovers. Very different, obviously, reporting than the
mm,
Han twins or the Champions, the arcade game story. But that kind of quote might come from someone who knew them, right?
mm,
And saying, "Wow, this was crazy that she was trying to kill literally her mirror image. Like, how
mm,
strange is that, right?"
mm,
Or if nothing else, and you really want to give that as a framework for the reader, you could put it in what we call the deck in
mm.
journalism lingo, which is just the sort of after the title, the
Mhm.
sort of the sort of teaser of what you're about to read, right? That's not officially part of the text of the story,
Right,
but it could
right,
be a great tool for sort of
right.
welcoming the reader and inviting them to consider reading it in a certain way.
Mhm. So how do you balance not being tied to the news cycle, but also not being so esoteric and totally weird that it wouldn't have any relevance to a contemporary reader, right? So it sounds like you're interested in like, turning over every stone and finding that story that hasn't been told, but you don't want it to be like so obscure that it's
Yeah.
totally alienating to the reader. But of course, at the same time, you don't want it to touch on, the same news stories we've heard 80 billion times. So how do you, or is that the challenge with every piece, kind of finding the way that it would relate and connect to a contemporary audience without necessarily having a contemporary agenda?
Yeah, I think we I don't think we think about that too explicitly. I think our tastes are probably broad enough, and maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not, that a story wouldn't sort of get far along in our process if it weren't just sort of connecting with us on a kind of primal, visceral
Mhm.
storytelling level of really saying, oh, what, I want to know how this unfolded, or I want to know, um, I want to know what happened next if we have
Mhm.
kind of the start of a story or the premise of a story. Um, so yeah, I don't think we. I think an esoteric story probably just wouldn't get past our guardrails.
Mhm. So what makes a great true crime story?
For us, it could be different. We are we're a little squeamish, so we don't do anything too gruesome.
Mhm.
In fact, we get pitched things sometimes that are sort of on the serial killer side of things that certainly has currency.
Mhm.
And it's not that we wouldn't consider it, we have considered it. And we did one story called The Occultists that does deal with a serial killer. But overall, the sort of tone of Truly Adventurous is kind of uplifting.
Mhm.
It's kind of escapist. We sort of just, again, that's sort of what we gravitate toward. Not that there's not serious things in the stories. There definitely can be, and sometimes are. But ultimately, we're trying to um, we're trying to give the reader a real sort of ride through somebody's experience and life, and our tastes tend toward the more uplifting
Mhm.
side of things. So for true crime, it really is tricky. Actually, it's hard
Yeah.
to find. Most crimes are, as you could expect, really awful, right?
Yeah.
They don't have much of a sort of redemptive side to them. We have our latest story is true crime, so that's an example of just something that sort of struck us as really intriguing, which is called Odd Caliber, and it's about a man in England. England has very strict gun laws, but he was a collector is was a collector of antique firearms. So he was an expert in both collecting them, identifying them, and kind of reconstructing them, um, and constructing the sort of ammunition for them. But because the UK has such strong laws against guns, and he started to need money, he started to sell them to gangs
Mhm.
in the UK. So the story opens with these crimes being committed and these murders being committed in the UK, and the police are just baffled because they're doing tests on the ammunition and bullets, and they're finding them to be like 19th century weapons all over the UK in kind of gang wars. So
Mhm.
it ends up kind of a Breaking Bad story where he needs the money and then gets addicted to the lifestyle of selling these antique firearms to actual criminals that are using them because they have very little choice of what to use. So that would be an example of something. It does have a serious side. People were murdered with these weapons, but there's also a sort of there's just something we can relate to, and all of our sort of the figures who present themselves as main characters in our stories, even if they're not someone we like, we look for that kind of that wish fulfillment on some level. We all have moments of wishing we could break the rules, or we
Mm,
could break through, or we could find a way to do what we want to do that we're being stopped from doing.
mhm,
And that's sort of a common denominator. We have a story called "The Richest Black Girl in America," and that is actually our most read story.
mhm,
It kind of went viral. Uh, Now, at that time, there was still longform.org, which many of your readers might have used. We loved it, and it has since closed down. It was a great aggregator of longform that really helped boost stories like "Richest Black Girl in America" for all kinds of publications. But in any case, that was about a 11-year-old girl in the early 1900s who had inherited a small plot of land that was worthless. It was, just sort of dry. You couldn't grow anything on it. But it ended up having the biggest geyser of oil in the country at the time on it, under it. And when it was discovered, she instantly overnight went from a young girl who walked, miles to school in shoes that were falling apart to being, as the title suggests, the richest Black girl in America.
mhm,
And there was this kind of real life Little Orphan Annie feeling to it. And again, this wish fulfillment. We all have had moments where you want to wake up and you just have everything you ever dreamed of. Of course, there was a dark side to it too, which is how that story ends up being structured.
mhm.
Just like fiction, none of these stories can really keep themselves going without conflict, without a problem.
Sure. How should a writer approach you if they have no publishing credits? Maybe they've never done this before, but they really, and sorry, the light, when I do these interviews, like it's very intense. If a writer hasn't done this before, but they have a story, and like they saw something or they know something, and they feel like they're the person to tell the story. Maybe they have writing experience, but they don't have journalistic experience. Can they what should they do? How should they contact you? How should they present themselves to you?
Yeah, we have a team email on our website, which is just trulyadventure.us. So it's like Truly Adventurous as a pun almost, trulyadventure.us. Um, and we read every pitch. Every pitch we get, we respond to every pitch we get. Hopefully in a timely way, as much as we can. And we would love to hear from anybody who has a story to tell. It could be a story from within their own orbit. It could be something similar to any of the examples I've given, or any others that are on our site, just something that you know about and that you'd want to dive into. And we've worked with writers who have maybe a lot of experience in other types of writing,
Mm,
or maybe have never really written anything like this before. It's just part of what we do. We're set up to do that, and hopefully, we think has been a great experience, certainly for us, but also for writers. So as I say, most stories, even our own stories that we bring to the table, don't end up being right to sort of get to the finish line. But we really love to hear from any writers who think that they might have a story that fits into this mold.
that's great. So a question, just like a behind the scenes
Yeah.
question. How you don't have subscriptions, or how is the magazine operating? What is the model for
A great question that luckily we remembered to think about that beforehand.
it?
We our business model is, so we're not part of any company, we're not part of any corporation, which increasingly, even some somewhat similar publications have been sort of absorbed. So we don't have that kind of infrastructure. Greg and I started, when we started the company, we bootstrapped it out of pocket. So we were writing checks to writers from our own checkbooks. Um, and our business model is looks something like this. So what we identified early on is we saw this inefficiency, which was we already talked about, which was that the traditional magazine and newspaper ecosystem does not particularly want to support this kind of writing, but readers love it, and writers, certainly we do, but many writers love to write in this format. So what we sort of discovered was that there was a whole other space that was very hungry for these types of stories, which were spaces that look for intellectual properties to develop into other medium. So film and TV, documentary, podcasts, even theater, animation. These are all spaces that are really interested in great true stories that haven't been told before. One metric you can use is, to look at the past 3 or 4 Oscar ceremonies, and you'll see a lot of the nominees are stories that are being told that are from true stories, more so than it used to be when any of us were growing up. True story has become a brand in itself in those spaces.
Mhm.
So what we're set up to do, and what we work very hard to do, is look for avenues for these stories to be developed further, in those formats. So we have, I think the number shifts around, but we have around 40 stories in development in film and TV, for example, from our library of what we've published so far. In fact, some of them are stories we haven't even yet published. So that's one of our primary business models. It's not our only source of revenue. We also try to we have a licensing arrangement, for example, with Medium, where a lot of our stories live. So we're able to subsidize some of our costs for the writing through that. And it's by no means the only metric of success for a story. It's obviously we can't guarantee stories finding a path in adaptation, but it's something that we work very hard to sort of maximize those opportunities.
That's really interesting, because I know lit mags are always looking for ways to make money, right? There are all these questions around charging reading fees for
Right.
writers who are submitting. But you've found this really interesting path, which does not involve charging reading fees, but it's getting the work into more kind of commercial territory.
Yeah, and it happens to be that what they look for is the same things that are the types of narratives that we saw being sort of under supported in the newspaper and magazine world. So yeah, as an example, the story we mentioned a few minutes ago, Richest Black Girl in America. We have a whole network of people who we share the stories with, to sort of spread the word about them and see if there's a potential path, in some form of adaptation. In that case, one of those folks, which is called a literary scout. So literary scouts are hired by various fields to look for stories that have potential. Put Richest Black Girl on the desk of someone named Steven Spielberg, who read it and circled it and said, "Go get this." And so that's set up with his company, Amblin Entertainment, with a screenwriter just working on the second draft now. And yeah, so we have some really exciting examples of that, and are always looking for sort of where we can get those stories. We have a story called Pillars of Fire, which is about another historical one about the first female police officer in Los Angeles, which we were able to pair up with Rachel Brosnahan, the star of Marvelous Miss Maisel, and to set that up at Amazon as a movie. And so that's also in, I think, the second draft of a screenplay. So very different model than most publications, but again, something that can support the whole catalog of stories that we're working on.
Sure. So what should a writer do if they pitch you and the pitch doesn't work out? Should they try again? Are they encouraged to try again?
Totally. We often hop on the phone with writers who pitch us, or even writers who just think they might be a good fit for us. We've sort of looked around for stories with writers that have, particularly if they have certain if they're immersed in certain worlds, again, separate from what their background is as a writer, but it could be geographical. It could be that the writer is based in New Orleans, and we stumble on a story in New Orleans, and say, hey, we spoke to John, and he lives in New Orleans. It could be that. It could be language. Sometimes we love international stories. There's a story now that I'm trying to figure out what to do with that happened in, or at least part of it happened in Spain. So I have to find a writer who can access, both can read Spanish and access records in Spain. Not easy. We have a story coming out that I assigned to a writer in Italy that I just found by Googling writers and talking to one of them. It wasn't right for him, and he referred me to another one, and that's called The Prince, about this guy who is the Prince of Montenegro, except that he's not. But he gets everyone to believe this, and he even sort of knighted Pamela Anderson. So there's these great pictures of him putting his sword on Pamela Anderson in this huge ceremony. So yeah, we love to interface with writers because we never know where that might lead.
Mm. And if somebody's listening to this, watching this, and they're thinking, oh my God, this is really cool, I want to get involved, are you ever looking for volunteer readers?
We don't have anything set up like that. We would love to just have you as a reader, reading the stories, particularly because that could spark ideas that you might have. But we have a very small team, and right now there's not room. We hope we'll be in a position where we can grow that team as well. But right now, the biggest value that writers can bring us is just to do what we call story hunting. Just really looking around at these kinds of stories, because they're everywhere. They're hiding in plain sight very often, and sometimes it just takes asking some questions. It just if you were at a dinner party and you ask everyone what's the craziest thing that's ever happened to you, or the craziest thing that you've ever heard that's happened. Once in a while, that could be, one of our stories is called Biker Girl. It's just, we found it randomly. We were engaging with a writer about something that didn't work out, and he said, hey, my friend Nicole was a corporate attorney doing bankruptcy law and by day, and she got sucked into the world of biker gangs by night. And started to spy on the district attorney's office because they were investigating the biker gang. And she shared a wall with them because her law office was adjacent to the district, and we're like, yeah, sold, and that became a story called Biker Girl. So yeah, you just never know where those stories are, and having writers who have the eye for that and develop the eye for that and the ear for that. And look, there's always the book world. The problem is with true stories, and you and I might commiserate and say it's a problem with fiction too, that should all fiction be expanded into a novel, but certainly with nonfiction, very few true stories can organically be expanded into 65, 75, 80,000 words. It's a tiny, tiny amount. And that's part of why the space is important, to be able to tell a full nonfiction story without it having to be a book, and without it having to be truncated so much that you can no longer see the story there. That's sort of our mission.
Right. That's great. So one final question I ask all editors: what keeps you doing this? I know you have a family of 3 kids, you have novels to write. What keeps you in the editing game?
I have friends who are writers who really only work on one thing at a time, and that kind of drives me crazy. So this is the perfect way, rather than for me to be working on multiple books at a time, which is not a good idea probably. This is the perfect way for me personally, to be able to engage in lots of different stories, lots of different types of stories, to sort of work those muscles. And it can be frustrating in all kinds of ways, just like any writing can be. The editing can be that as well, especially when a story does get stuck, which again will happen more with nonfiction than, or for different reasons with nonfiction than it will for fiction. But when you break through that, when you find even better things than you thought you were going to find, it's really exciting. So I still have that that fire for the format of narrative nonfiction that I first discovered kind of accidentally.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for telling us all about it. Everybody go check out Truly Adventurous. It sounds like just such an amazing project. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Becky.